So welcome everybody first of all to our second seminar of the series this year. Today we have Associate Professor Dara Stanley. I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to and background to Dara's work, and then Dara is going to give us a 20-minute or so presentation and have some opportunity for Q&A afterwards. So Dara is an Associate Professor here in Entomology, Applied Entomology in the School of Agriculture and Food Science. Her broad research interests span biodiversity, ecology, conservation, and sustainable agriculture, with a very specific focus on pollinators, plants, and insects. So she did a PhD in Trinity, 2 postdocs in London and South Africa before moving to NUIG as lecturer, and then here to Austin at UCD. She's co-chair of the Earth Institute's biodiversity team and has leading roles in the Irish Pollinator Research Network and the All-Ireland Climate and Biodiversity Research Network. She didn't include this when she sent it to me, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Dara also has a lot of awards, including the British Ecology Society Founders Prize, SFI Early Careers Researcher of the Year, and the Royal Entomological Society Marshall Award for Early Career Entomologists. She's also very interested in science communication and public engagement. So today she's going to talk to us about pollinators and agriculture, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Great. Well, I hope everyone is pretty caffeinated and ready to talk about pollinators for the next 25 minutes or so. So the brief given to us for these seminars is to keep it super broad, to talk about what we do, why it's interesting, and how we do it. So I'm going to attempt to do that. You can judge for yourselves at the end whether you think I've managed to do that or not. So the first seminar in this series was a fantastic seminar by Trudy, who talked about her work as an oocyte biologist and about reproduction in cattle. But today we're going to move away from cattle and talk about reproduction in plants. So the vast majority of, plants first of all have a problem. They can't get up and move. They can't go and find a mate. So they've had to evolve ways to transport their genetic material from individual to individual. Some plants do this using the wind, a very small amount does this using the water, but the vast majority of flowering plants involve relationships with pollinators to help them to transport pollen from individual to individual. I'm really proud of this picture. Very hard to get pictures like this of bees, but here we've got a small solitary bee. You can see its head is right in the bottom of this buttercup flower. It has its tongue out, it's drinking nectar. It's also collected pollen on its back leg that it's going to bring back to feed to its developing larvae. But all over its body, you mightn't be able to see so well from where you're sitting, but there's small pollen grains on its abdomen, around its head, on the hairs of its body. And it's this loose pollen that when it flies to the next flower, it will rub off accidentally onto the stigmas of that next flower, helping it to reproduce. So that is how pollination works. And pollination is really important. Nearly 90% of all flowering plants globally require pollination in some way to help them to reproduce. So the health of our natural ecosystems is very dependent on pollination. So I have 2 pictures here of habitats in Ireland that are very pollinator dependent, a species-rich grassland and also a hedgerow and farmland. But it's not just about wild systems. Pollination is also really important in the production of a large proportion of global crops. So nearly 75% of all of the crops that we grow globally depend to some degree on pollination for yields. So it's not all crops. Some of our heavy hitters, things like wheat, rice, these are grass-based crops, and these are pollinated by wind. But a huge proportion of our other crops, things like soy, coffee, fruit crops, nut crops, seed crops, depend on insect pollination. So some crops, like, as I said, Aussie rape, coffee and soy, they're partially pollinator dependent. You get reductions in yields of anywhere between 1% and 40% without insect pollinators. Other things like apples, mangoes, you get anywhere between a 40 to 90% reduction in yield without insect pollinators. And some crops, such as berries, are heavily pollinator dependent. You get basically no yield without insect pollination. So I often say to students, who would have coffee, who would have chocolate, all of the good things in life if it wasn't for insect pollinators. And they're also really important in terms of nutrition. About 70% of or 90% of our vitamin C, a huge proportion of folic acid, vitamin A, all come from insect pollinated crops. Okay, so who are these pollinators that we're talking about? Globally, there's a whole host of organisms involved in pollination: birds, bats, lizards, small mammals, all sorts of interesting things in tropical regions. But really, the most important pollinators globally are the insects. And certainly here in Ireland, pretty much all of our pollinators are insects. So in an Irish context, things like butterflies and moths are important pollinators. Things like hoverflies, we've about 180 species of hoverflies, 35 species of butterflies, over 1,500 species of moths. These are all important pollinator groups. But one of the most important, or the most important group of pollinators in the world are the bees. So about 20,000 species of bees globally. And bees are really important pollinators because they feed on nectar and pollen from flowers as adults, but they also collect pollen to bring back to feed to their developing larvae. So they're not just visiting flowers to fill themselves, they're consistently visiting flowers to collect, to bring back to feed their larvae back in their nests. So so that's why bees are particularly important pollinators globally. Any guesses how many species of bees we have in Ireland?
Honeybees or not?
All bees, bee species.
Sure, many more than anyone could intuitively think, but I don't know, a lot.
Okay, you're like the undergrad classes. This is, so we actually went out and we asked the Irish public, this is a survey that was done by Katie Burns, who did her PhD with us a few years ago. And she was interested in seeing how the general public perceive pollinators. So this is one of the questions she asked the public: how many species of bees do we have in Ireland? Turns out most people like yourselves weren't so sure. We have about 100 species of bee in Ireland, so we gave a bit of a window of correctness there. So you can see some people got it in the right general area. Most people underestimated the number of bee species in Ireland. So it's interesting that pollinators are out there doing their thing, but we don't understand a huge amount about them. So Channel's already started this conversation, but the reason I think a lot of people underestimate the number of bees in Ireland is because we know an awful lot about one species of bee, and that's this bee. This is the honeybee, Apis mellifera, definitely the most famous bee in the world. And it is one of our 100 bee species in Ireland. So the honeybee is super important as a pollinator, but also really important because it produces honey, and we've domesticated it as humans. So in Europe now, the vast majority of honeybees are domesticated by us as humans. We've very little, if any, wild populations left of honeybees. They're in huge colonies, thousands of individuals. There's a queen, and the colonies overwinter as whole colonies. But this is only one of our 100 bee species in Ireland. We also have 21 species now of bumblebees. These are the furry characteristic bees that you think of summertime, the sound of summer is the buzz of a bumblebee. And you tell the species apart based on their colour patterns. So we have a buff-tailed bumblebee, a red-shank cardabee, great yellow bumblebee, and so on and so forth. So bumblebees, like honeybees, they're colonial, they live in colonies, but they're much smaller. There's a queen and workers, but over winter, the whole colony dies out and the queens hibernate individually. But actually, the majority of bee species that we have in Ireland are not social. As their name suggests, they're solitary. Each individual bee makes their own nest. And we have roughly about 80 species of solitary bees in Ireland. They're smaller, skittish, a little bit harder to see, but they're really important pollinators of a wide variety of things in an Irish setting. So the research that I'm interested in is really at the intersection, I suppose, between pollinators and agriculture. So we're interested in how pollinators influence agriculture, and then we're interested as well in how agriculture in turn then influences pollinators. So I'm going to try and give you a flavour of some of these things that we've been looking at in terms of crop pollination, in terms of agri-environmental management, pesticide use, and land use change. So I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. So let's start off talking about the good. So a few things I want to mention here are crop pollination and agri-environment schemes. And there's one of my PhD students, Katie, in an apple orchard in Kilkenny, looking at pollinators visiting the apple trees there. So we've invested a good amount of time in the last number of years looking at the pollination of Irish crops. So our Irish agricultural system is largely grass-based. We don't grow as many insect-pollinated crops as other countries in the world, but we do grow some. We grow things like berries would be big. Clover is insect-pollinated, which is obviously increasingly being grown across Ireland. But we've looked specifically at these three crops here. So we've looked at field beans, oilseed rape, and apple as three important pollinator-dependent crops in Ireland. So field beans, a fanfare variety. You get about a 50% decrease in yield if you exclude insect pollinators from the crop. Oilseed rape, you get about a 30% decrease in seed production. And apples, depending on the variety, you get anywhere between 50 to 90% decrease in yield if it isn't for insect pollinators. And these are kind of the Irish varieties that we've looked at. But it becomes interesting when you start looking at what pollinators are actually involved in the pollination of these crops. So for apples and oilseed rape, you can see it's a variety of different pollinators. We've got bumblebees, honeybees, solitary bees, and hoverflies involved in the pollination of these crops. They're quite open flowers, they're accessible, it's possible for lots of different insects to get into them. But when you start looking at field beans, although you might see honeybees and a few different bee groups active in field bean fields, they're much more complicated flowers, they're very hard for bees to get into. And as a result, it's really only bumblebees and only long-tongued bumblebees, which is a subset of species that are actually good and effective pollinators of field bean crops. Another key take home here is that the only managed pollinator that we found in these fields were honeybees, and all the other pollinators active in these crops providing pollination services are all wild insects that are naturally there in farmland providing these services back to our crops. And this is work that was done by Katie Burns, who's hidden there at the top. So farmland is also a really important habitat. Farmland habitats are also really important for pollinators. And in fact, some of the most important pollinator habitats in Ireland are farmed habitats, things like species-rich grasslands and hedgerows. And increasingly, we're trying to improve the amount and the quality of habitats and agricultural landscapes through agri-environment schemes. And this is another area we've been working in recently. So in the past, our agri-environment schemes were what we call prescription-based, but farmers received payments for putting in measures, regardless of their outcomes or their quality. But we've moved now more towards a results-based system for our agri-environment schemes, where farmers get paid based on the biodiversity outcomes or the environmental outcomes that are delivered through the measures they put in. So we've been interested in this concept of results-based agri-environment schemes through Michelle Larkin's PhD. And really one of the pilot results-based agri-environment schemes in Ireland is a very well-known one and that won a lot of awards internationally was the Burren programme in the Burren. So many of you will be familiar with the Burren. It's a fantastic region. It's an agriculturally dominated landscape, but it's incredibly biodiverse. About 70% of our Irish plant species occur in this region. But the Burren programme was implemented in a results-based agri-environment scheme in the Burren. So they went into fields, they scored them, gave them a biodiversity value, A being high and D being low, and then farmers received payments, higher payments for higher biodiversity scores. But of course, in these systems, biodiversity scores are generated using plants. It makes sense. Plants can't fly away or run away. They're there all the time. You can go into a field and you can score it very easily based on the plants that are there. But we wanted to ask the question, right, so the scheme is based on plants, but is it working for other biodiversity groups, in this case, pollinators? So Michelle had a network of fields all around the Burren with different scores within this agri-environment scheme, and she was looking at pollinators within them. And this is just one quick result from there about bumblebees. So it seems like the scheme is working for bumblebees. So fields that received a lower score, a D score, had less bumblebee species than fields that received a higher score. So it's working well for bumblebees. Fortunately, not working so well for hoverflies and butterflies. So if we want to include these groups, or we want to ensure that these groups are covered under these schemes, we might need to adapt them somewhat to ensure they're working for these other groups as well. Also in the agri-environmental space, we've been working up in northwest Mayo in the Bullet Peninsula. If any of you are from that region, you should be very proud because it's the only place in Ireland where the great yellow bumblebee still exists. It's a species that was formerly found all around Ireland, but now is only found in this region because it still has quite a high density of species-rich grasslands, which have been lost elsewhere in the country. And this is Lydia, who's currently doing her PhD in this area with the Great Yellow Bumblebee Working Group. And Lydia has been looking at two agri-environmental measures that have been trialled up there, which are delayed mowing and reduced grazing. And she's testing their effectiveness for bumblebees. And again, it's quite a good news story. It turns out both of them are working quite well for bumblebees in this region. So in summary, there's a lot we can do in the agri-environmental space for pollinators. We know some things work, we know there's issues with others, but it certainly is an opportunity for pollinator conservation. So that was kind of the good, but I did also promise some of the bad, I'm afraid. And the bad is that unfortunately it's not all good news when it comes to bees and other pollinators. We do know that pollinators are declining globally. We've good data on bees, and we've okay data on other pollinator groups. So the graph I've shown here is from UK, and this is looking at bees and their close relatives and the number of extinctions over time, and you can see it's increasing dramatically. And we do know that 30% of our bee species in Ireland are also threatened with extinction. So one of the potential causes or things related to bee decline is the use of pesticides. So pesticides, we use them heavily in modern agriculture, and they're really important for the way we currently produce food and the scale at which we produce it. But of course, when we use pesticides in agricultural areas, they come in contact with the target pests, but they can also come into contact with beneficial organisms that are also active in the same places, like pollinators. So we apply pesticides to crops in two main ways in Ireland, using sprays and using seed dressings. And these can result in either topical exposure of pollinators, where they're directly sprayed or they come into contact with plant parts that have pesticides on them, or it can result in oral exposure, where they feed on nectar and pollen that's being contaminated and they ingest it orally that way. Now, when pesticides are placed on the market, they are risk assessed for potential risks to bees, as well as a whole host of other things. But there are some limitations to the current risk assessment. First of all, risk assessments for bees are based just on honeybees. And hopefully you now know that honeybees differ a lot in their biology and ecology to other bee species. They're not necessarily a good model species for other bees. Secondly, pesticide risk assessment is initially based on mortality, based on levels of pesticide that will kill bees, and they don't take into account sublethal effects. So effects maybe on their behavior or reproduction that will ultimately affect their populations. And so that's another limitation. Also, pesticides are risk assessed singly, but of course we all know that pesticides are applied in combinations and multiple different active ingredients are used in fields at the same time. So we know bees are exposed to a variety of combinations of pesticides in the field. And finally, there's kind of not a huge amount of research done on mitigation measures and ways in which we can reduce impacts of pesticides on bees when they are used. So with this kind of a background, we've been interested for quite a while in the sublethal impacts of pesticides on non-honeybees and bees other than honeybees. And this is a study I was involved in a number of years ago now, but here we looked at whether low levels of field realistic exposure to pesticides could impact the ability of bumblebees to deliver pollination services to crops. So exposed bumblebees to these low levels of pesticide. And what we found was that you can see in this graph here at the slightly higher concentration, which is still in the field realistic range, the apples that had been pollinated by these bees had less seeds, which is related to apple quality, but also related to the general fecundity of plants. So it seems that when bees are exposed to these low levels of pesticides, it can influence their ability to pollinate crops. So we followed on from this research over the last number of years, and I won't go into details on most of it, but just to give you a flavour of some of the things we've been doing here. This is Lindsay Thompson, who did her PhD on the Protect project, where we were focusing on fungicides and herbicides as two of the most kind of widely used groups in Ireland. We use less insecticides in Ireland, I suppose, overall. Here's Lindsay in the teaching labs during COVID, the poor thing, with our big flight arenas, and she's connected up bumblebee colonies to those flight arenas. She can look at how those bumblebees behave in the flight arenas, how they visit feeders, how they visit flowers. There on the left-hand side, there's bees in harnesses that are happy, and they're going to be exposed to an odour conditioning trial. So we're able to assess their ability to learn different odours and then see how that's impacted by exposure to pesticide. There's Lindsay outside on campus with some bumblebee colonies that she's left outside to look at how they develop over time. And we're really lucky to have down at Rosemount this network of insect cages that we can use and in them we can put different plants, we can put different bees, we can look at their behaviour, we can look at their ability to deliver pollination services. So it's something we've been using quite a lot as well. So this is just one study that was done by Alison, who's hidden up here as well under the Susfall project. And here she was using our cages down in Rosemount. She had bumblebee colonies in there that had been exposed to low levels of pesticide, and she looked at their ability to visit plants. She used camera recording, she used behavioural logging software and things like that. And she found that when bees were exposed to low levels of lambda-cylothrin, which is the most widely used insecticide in Ireland, or pyrethroid, and dimethoate, which is kind of a positive control, she found that bees exposed to low levels of these pesticides were not able to collect pollen themselves. There was a lower number of bees returning with pollen. So pollen is really important for larval development and colony development. So reduction in pollen probably has an impact on bee reproduction overall. We've also then been interested in mitigation measures for bees and pesticides. So are there ways in which we can use pesticides better or differently to reduce the potential impacts on pollinators? So Ed Straw was a postdoc in the Protect project, and together with Adele, he did a nice study where he surveyed Irish farmers to see how well they were using pesticides in comparison to pesticide usage guidelines. Turns out really well for things related to bees, but actually not so well when it was things related to their own human health. So that was quite an interesting finding. And also we did some work looking at spraying pesticides at different times of day and potential impacts on pollinators there as well. So the final thing I wanted to mention then, underneath the bad umbrella, I'm afraid, is around land use change. And this is some work we've been doing in Africa over the last number of years under 2 PhD projects. So up in that tree, if you can just about see in that picture, is Christine Coppinger, and she's climbed trees to put up insect traps, where she's going to trap pollinators in this dry forest ecosystem she's been working in Zambia. So she's been working in northwestern Zambia, in a region that's mostly tropical dry forest, you can see in the green, but increasingly agriculture is expanding in this area, particularly along transport routes. So this is a road here, and you can see the amount of land devoted to agriculture in red there is increasing all the time. So Christine's PhD was interested in thinking about pollinators, forests, and human livelihoods, and she worked closely with Anne and Monica throughout her PhD as well. And this is one study she designed, where she was looking at the pollinators that were in landscapes dominated by agriculture versus pollinators that were in landscapes dominated by forests. This is Richard Boachi, who finished his PhD with us a few years ago as well. And Richard was asking similar questions when he was working in Ghana in Northwest Africa, and he was working in the west of Ghana in Bia conservation area. So again, it's a region where the native vegetation, which is tropical forest, has been cleared for agriculture and agricultural expansion. So in green there, you can see the area that is the original tropical forest, and it's actually a protected area, which is why it still remains. Richard used to work there. And then in purple around it, you can see the land that's been cleared for agriculture. And the primary agricultural use here is cocoa production. So Richard, again, was sampling in landscapes dominated by forests and sampling in landscapes dominated by cocoa to see the impacts of land use change on pollinators. And this is what he found. So you can see the proportion of natural forest in the landscape is on the x-axis. And for 3 of the 4 insect groups there, you can see when you have more natural forest in the landscape, you have more of the insects. So it seems that the conversion to agriculture is having negative impacts on these groups. Flies are the diptera are the exception. You actually get more flies in areas with more agriculture, and that's potentially because the key pollinators of cocoa are actually flies. So that makes sense in that context. So hopefully that's given you a flavour of some of the things we've been doing over the last few years in this kind of relationship between pollinators and agriculture, how pollinators impact agriculture and how agriculture impacts pollinators in good and bad ways. I did also promise the ugly. I kind of ran out of steam at this point, I have to admit, but I thought of a few things late last night. The first thing I think I have to mention in this space is the Asian hornet. The Asian hornet made its way to Ireland for the first time this year, and there's 2 colonies are eradicated down in Cork. Originally from Asia, it's invaded all of mainland Europe, and there's a real risk to honeybees in particular. We know it's had quite significant impacts on honeybees in continental Europe. It's probably impacting our wild bees as well, but we know very little about that. Hopefully we can continue to eradicate it in Ireland, but it's certainly going to be something that we're increasingly going to have to deal with over the coming years. Quite a scary looking thing, so you can see if you think it's ugly. In the ugly space as well, I have two small daughters. They were asking me the other day what baby bees look like. So I'm showing you a picture here of a baby bee, which is obviously a little bee larva. And some of our students in labs don't like the look of those and think they look ugly. And then finally, I have to show you this. I think this is very beautiful, but our third year students disagree. This is a giant African flower beetle. It belongs to Sarah Keenan, our technical officer, and she brings it to some of our third year labs to show some of our parasites and beneficial students. As I said, some of the students love it and think it's beautiful. Some of the students really dislike it and think it's ugly. So just to mention some future work that we have coming up or on the cards over the next few years. The first is around pollinators and soils. So the world of pollinator research and conservation has been charging ahead, in the world of soil research and policy has been charging ahead. But actually these two worlds very much are connected to each other, because the vast majority of pollinator species, or at least a huge proportion, are dependent on the soil at various stages of their life cycles. So this is a really big Horizon Europe project, Pro Soil, that we're involved in, myself, Olaf, Simon and Julia Jones at UCD, and with a whole lot of collaborations around Europe, so we're really excited about that. We're also running a project called SAFER, which is the expansion of agroecology across Europe and implications for ecosystem services, pollination being one, but one of a suite of different services we'll look at. And finally, we'll have a big project starting next summer looking at honeybee competition. So honeybees are as I said, they're mostly domesticated in Europe now, and as beekeepers, we are changing the natural populations of natural numbers of honeybees in the environment. And we know from elsewhere that this can have implications for wild pollinators, but we haven't looked at it in detail in Ireland yet. So we'll be doing that through that Research Ireland project. Lots of ideas, of course. I'll be talking to Gary about other crops and pollination. I'd also really interested in thinking more about human nutrition and things with pollination. So lots of future things to explore as well. Finally, as most of you are aware, one of the real privileges of being an academic is getting to work with networks of early career researchers. And I'm really lucky to work with a great team of people. Some people have been with us for a while, some people are just starting or will be starting, but I just wanted to mention them because they're so crucial to the research that we do. And that takes me to the end. So a huge thank you for giving me your time on a Thursday morning. I also really want to thank a whole load of collaborators that I haven't listed here, but that are fundamental to the work that we do, and also to the farmers and landowners that we work very closely with. And again, that we couldn't do a lot of the things we do without. So thank you very much for listening. We know that they do that because as soon as they get the odor, they then stick out their tongue in anticipation of the reward. But it's a very simple way to actually look at their learning ability. And then we can test and see if things like pesticides alter their ability to learn that association.
So if they recognize the dangers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So any questions for Dara? Alex, David, person and David.
Talking about pesticides, what about herbicides and glyphosate?
Yeah, good question. So, under the text project, we look specifically at herbicides and fungicides because they're the most widely used pesticides that we use in Irish agriculture. So herbicides are an interesting one because they're not designed to target insects. They're designed to target plants, obviously. We do find that they can change things in the gut microbiome of bees. We do find they can have behavioral changes, but there's still a lot to be worked out there as to what exactly is going on. But another key thing with herbicides, it's not just around direct impacts on bees, it's only impacts on bees' forage resources. So when we use herbicides, we're killing plants. If they're flowering plants, they're potential forage for bees. So we did do one study down in Rosemount where we sprayed plants with glyphosate. It takes them about 72 hours to die. But in that time period, bees would still happily visit them and feed on the nectar and pollen and consume glyphosate. So yeah, lots of potential things there to learn more about. But certainly the two routes of impact would be impact on forage resources or their direct impacts on the bees themselves. Although potentially nowhere near as toxic as these.
And I'm just wondering what the sort of pollinator research community, their attitude to, it's an obvious solution for the insecticides and the effects on these beneficial insects is genetic engineering and gene editing of the crops or the vegetables, the fruits, so that they express insecticidal proteins and only in the tissues. Anyway, they wouldn't necessarily be toxic to the bees because they're targeted to lepidopteran larvae, for example. And, in Europe, we have this basically Luddite approach to genetic engineering in agriculture and other aspects of agricultural biotechnology. But it's quite clear, at least to me, that, an obvious solution, if it were permissible, would be to avoid the use of topical insecticides and be allowed to use genetic engineering. I don't know, what does your research community kind of think of that?
Yeah, very good question. And to be honest, it hasn't been discussed in massive amounts. It hasn't been on the paper, hasn't been on the agenda in the European context. A key problem with insecticides is that they've never been species specific. They've never been targeted. They're always broad spectrum. So, anything that can become more targeted for specific pests would be welcome. I don't actually know enough about genetic engineering, and I've talked to you more about that as to how that works. But certainly, yeah, it would be part of the solution. Yeah, and I'm trying to think of other places where it's been implemented, obviously in the US and things. I actually don't know enough about the literature and stuff, what the impacts have been there from a pollination point of view.
Well, yeah, there was this famous study from about 25 years ago that showed the BT, one of the BT crops was having an effect on bees in the laboratory, which, you might expect in a laboratory setting, but then that was published in Nature, and then a couple of months later, a field study was done, which is published in PNAS, and showed there wasn't any effect in the field, any noticeable effect. So, there's been plenty of work, and the science has moved on a great deal since then, and particularly with gene editing, it's possible to really do this in a targeted way, and it's just it seems to be something completely ignored in Europe because of political machinations.
Yeah. Well, watch this space.
Is it something that's happening in America?
Well, no, using BT crops have been used for. There are other problems with monocultures, and then only using glyphosate for herbicide control because you have plants that are, genetically engineered to be resistant to glyphosate, which then affects milkweed, which has impacts on other insects and stuff. But in terms of the effect on pollinators and genetically engineered crops, to my mind anyway, are a win-win because they can be made so that, there's no effect on the beneficial insects. The herbicide-resistant crops would be a different matter. But again, you were saying, Dara, they're less toxic anyway.
Potentially, but you bring up an interesting point there about monocultures and rotations, and all the things that could potentially become issues or less used when you start having BT crops, and they have been huge issues in the US for a variety of other reasons. And you mentioned the glyphosate resistant crops mean excessive use of glyphosate, which then means there's more glyphosate in non-target areas, which is impacts on natural vegetation and therefore pollinators in that way. So there's no silver bullet, I think, but it certainly is an interesting one to explore. Yeah.
Hey, Dara, thanks for that. You mentioned the hornet. How did the hornet get to Ireland? Was that through imported fruit and veg, or did it? Do we know? And then the second question I had for you was, in its native environment, has it completely displaced the honeybee or the bee population?
Yeah, really good question. So the first one, so the hornet was first introduced to France accidentally, obviously, around early 2000s or somewhere between 2000 and 2010, and it's taken off. So there's a really large established population in France, in Spain, and in Brittany, where we're very well connected to with multiple ferry options. So they don't know exactly where the genetic quirk came from, but they do probably think it was via some of the ferry connections. It's very easy for them to get on a ferry, into a camper van, a lorry, whatever it might be. So it's a reason why we're really going to have increasing incursions into Ireland over the next number of years. The UK are still in an eradication phase with it, but they eradicated nearly 80 nests in England last year. So, it's definitely the risk is increasing in the UK all the time. I think if the UK stay in eradication phase, I think we have a very good chance. But I think if the UK, if the full invasion happens in the UK, I think it's probably going to be inevitable here. What happens in the native range, really interesting. So it's natively from Asia. And in Asia, there's the Asian honeybee, Apis cerana, and there's also the Asian honeybee has adapted well to dealing with these, or at least somewhat. They have this kind of heat falling behavior that they do, so they can, if a hornet goes into the nest, they can surround the hornet, that they can increase their body temperatures enough to kill the hornet. And European honeybees, Apis mellifera, can do this heat blowing behavior a bit, but not quite to the same temperature that Apis cerana can do it. So that's the reason that it's a classic example of biological invasion, where the kind of native species here don't have the same tools or ability to defend themselves as species do in the native range.
How much of opening a Pandora box would be to import the Asian honeybees here so they learn to deal with the hornets?
Huge. They're obviously very ecologically different to our species here. They have different farming preferences. They would compete differently with our native species. So I think probably a much better strategy would be to try and deal with the hornet. But one thing we don't know a huge amount about is the impacts hornets have on our other wild bees, bumblebees and solitary bees. They might have less impacts because the colonies are harder to find. There's less individuals coming in and out. They're smaller, so it might be that they can't find them as easily. There was one interesting study that did look at bumblebees in Spain, and they found that bumblebees, actually, if they're attacked by a hornet, the bumblebees do a strange behavior where they just drop to the ground, and the hornet kind of gets a bit lost and let them go. So it might be that there are behavioral adaptations in some other species can begin to adapt their behavior, but we don't know much about it at all. So it's certainly something we need to learn more about.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm just wondering if your group have seen changes in the populations of the pollinators, because changes that we're seeing in agriculture at the moment, for example, the more mixed species crops in grasslands, use of more cover crops in tillage, the seed dressing, the neonicotinoids, they've been banned for a number of years now, so that's probably helped. But is it too early to see changes in the populations yet, or where do you see that going?
Unfortunately, things are still on a downward trend, even with these changes. It might be too early to see changes in things like the neonics. So, for example, in the Protect project, we sampled nectar and pollen of crops and wild plants and hedgerows and soils, and we're still finding residues of neonics across the board. So neonics have a very long half-life. It takes them a really long time to break down. So we probably still have quite a lot of neonic contamination out there in the environment already. The use of cover crops, multi-species swards and stuff, yes, probably beneficial. Hopefully, we might get to look at cover crops within the Safer project. It's something we're considering. But again, they're not that widely adopted across the Irish landscape yet. Now, a slightly sad thing or concerning thing is that I was involved in a study that was published 2 weeks ago in Science, and that was looking at the amount of habitat that's needed for pollinators and agricultural landscapes to conserve them. At the moment, our targets are to have about 10% biodiversity-friendly habitat on farmland, but unfortunately, this study showed that we need a lot more, anywhere between 60 to 30% to properly conserve some key pollinator groups. So, things are changing, and things are changing for the better, but unfortunately, haven't seen a reversal or a halting in declines yet.
Cheers, you. Good. Okay, well, I think that's all, Dara. Thanks very much. We'll have our next seminar on the 11th day. Yeah, thanks very much.